said, please interrupt me at any point if you have questions or any comments. I'm also going to leave a little bit of time at the end for more of a discussion if there's more points. But the point of this paper is to try to understand whether people who are socially mobile in life are more likely to veer to the left or to the right, right? So I will explain in a bit that intuitively it's not ex ante clear in which direction this may go, and then try to understand how is that going to impact, so this social mobility, how this is going to impact people's political preferences, especially keeping an eye on preferences for redistribution. And then in the second part of the paper, we're going to try to think a little bit more about the mechanism between this link, right? So, and we're going to try to think about potential mediators, where well-being is going to be one of them, and the other one, which is kind of like the usual suspect in the literature, is kind of beliefs about fairness. But first of all, why should we care about preferences for redistribution? So I think in economics, this has been quite a large literature and very much increasing recently. And the reason economists and social scientists are interested in preferences for redistribution is because they tend to be quite well linked to individual voting behavior. And in particular, when it comes to social mobility and social standing, there is a strong empirical and to some extent also theoretical link between the individual social standing, right? So your position in the income distribution or in the wealth distribution or some kind of measure of class, and preferences for the allocation of welfare and the structure of taxation, right? So this is quite a well-established empirical link. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this today because it's not really the question we're trying to ask, but just to give you two kind of pieces of information which you consistently find in empirical studies. So one of them is that the wealthy tend to be more right-wing, and the second one is that they are less open to redistribution than those who are relatively poor or relatively less well-off. All right, and from a mechanism perspective,
maybe it's not shared yet.
Yeah, is it fine now for the slides?
Can everyone see the
No,
slide?
I cannot see them for some reason. I don't know how other people, if they can see it online, but normally it just comes up, but.
Did not share it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you for this feedback, Simone.
It's all right.
is it better now?
Yes, they uploaded now. Great, thank you.
No, thank you for mentioning it. Yeah, so as I said, like in the literature, what you find empirically is that wealthy tend to be more right-wing, right? So they tend to vote for more, let's say, conservative parties, for example, in the context of the UK, and they're less open to redistribution, right? And intuitively, this kind of reflects self-interest, right? So the more you have, the wealthier you are, the more the rich have to lose by essentially supporting policies that are going to favor redistribution. So this is kind of seen as an egotropic type of mechanism, right? One thing we're going to try to think about more carefully in our paper is whether one's starting position in life matters, right? So independent of the fact that the wealthier are more likely to be right-wing or to be against redistribution, does it matter where they started from? And does social mobility has an independent, significant impact on political preferences, right? So here, independent of own social state. Now, in the literature on the link between social mobility and support for redistribution, we have two kind of, let's say, thoughts, right? Two kind of strands of literature. So on the one hand is literature starting with Piketty, which talks about the role of past experiences and beliefs, right? So the idea there, and Piketty here talks about like long-standing left-wing dynasties, is that entire generations of people who didn't experience social mobility are going to see this experience of not being able to move up in life as essentially being more about luck rather than their effort in life, right? So intuitively, you're going to think that because I haven't moved up in life, my parents haven't moved up in life, it's not to do with the effort that we put, but rather to do with luck, right? So the ability to become wealthier in life or to move up on the social status scale is going to depend on whether you were lucky enough to be born in the right environment or go to the right school, etc. Right? And on the other hand, Piketty argues that those who have experienced social mobility in their life, they're going to be more likely to update their beliefs such that they assign more weight to the role of effort, right? So I moved up in life, that's because I worked hard, right? On the other hand, you have another strand of literature which talks not so much about your own experience, but about your own belief about the likelihood that you will be able to move up in the future, right? So this is what Benabou and co-authors call the prospect of upper mobility, the idea being that it is perhaps rational and consistent for people at the bottom of the income distribution to be against redistribution policies, which would in theory favor them, because they have the belief that in the future they themselves or perhaps their offspring are going to be upper in the distribution of income, right? They're going to move up. And so because they perceive this as a potential of losing in the future, they are going to be against redistribution, right? So these two have fairly different predictions for people who are at the bottom of the distribution of income, but in both cases, both of these strands of literature kind of rely on beliefs about the prevalence of social mobility, right? Whether these beliefs are shaped by your own experiences in the past or about your own belief about moving up in. Now, in line with this, a lot of the empirical literature on social mobility and how people vote or whether people support redistribution has focused predominantly on the role of beliefs, right? Like I said, beliefs about your own social standing or the prospect of upper mobility. And a lot of these studies, which are mostly based on large-scale survey data, typically find that the wealthy tend to be more optimistic about social mobility and less likely to support policies for redistribution, right? So this is the typically consistent finding across countries. Kind of symmetrically, those people who are less off are less optimistic about social mobility and more likely to vote for left-wing parties, right? So this is what we find empirically. Now, what we're interested in our paper is to look at this from a slightly different angle, because beliefs about mobility, and this is kind of increasingly well known in economics as well, do not correspond well to the economic reality, right? And this is both in terms of the position in the income distribution, right? So individuals themselves in experiments or in surveys not do a very good job of estimating where they actually stand, and also in terms of mobility prospects, right? So this is a paper by LSE, but more recently as well, LSE and co-authors showed that in the US and in a number of European countries, if you survey people about their beliefs in terms of mobility, you find that they are very bad at estimating this, right? And typically what they show is that in the US, people tend to be overly optimistic, right? So if you ask somebody in the US, what is the probability that somebody is going to move from the bottom quintile of the income distribution to the top one in their lifetime, Americans tend to overestimate that, while in Europe, and particularly in France, for example, people tend to be overly pessimistic, right? But in general, the conclusion is that people are not very good at estimating this, right? So then from a policy perspective, you might be interested in knowing which is a better predictor. Is it what people think, or is it the actual observed distribution, which is going to determine what people do, right? Or what they support. Now, if you look at the empirical literature on this, predictive power here is a little bit mixed. So on the one hand, you have slightly older studies, which mostly use survey data, which show that beliefs about mobility tend to be quite well correlated with political preferences and tend to do better than objective measures. This is mostly relying on survey data. But in more recent evidence, especially from experimental data or from the lab, you find that actually beliefs about mobility perform the same or sometimes even worse than objective measures. And this is particularly true for mobility in education or in occupation. For income, it's a bit less clear. People are not very good at estimating that.
Sorry, could I?
Yeah.
So are these studies based on, so you ask the individual what they believe in and then you observe them over time, or is it just a country predictor and therefore the survey is based on, like you survey people and then you see what the country predictors are, or is it actually the same people achieving something?
So it depends a little bit on the study. What a lot of them do is that you ask individuals where they think they are in the distribution, and then you see based on what they think, what are they likely to support in terms of redistribution, right? So I ask you, do you think you are at the bottom of the income distribution? And if you say yes, are you more likely to support redistribution?
Okay.
Right? In some papers, so for example, LSE and co-authors, they also provide people with information about this and see whether they update their beliefs. But a lot of it is just like a lot of surveys just ask people questions like, do you think you did better than your father? Or do you think you're performing particularly well? Or in which quintile of the distribution do you think you are? And then see how that correlates. Right? And a very small number of studies, they also have some objective measures, and then they kind of try to see whether the two correlate well. And this is what I mean here when I say that the evidence is a bit mixed, because sometimes these beliefs tend to be better predictor of what people actually do or what they support, and sometimes not so much. Right?
But so in the first block of studies, they are objective, because in the second it's an experiment. I understand what the objective measures are coming from, but in the first, the objective measure is then what if it's a population-wide samples?
So, for example, here it's whether you are, if what your social class is higher than your parents.
Okay.
And here I think they use actual distributions of the entire population and then provide people with information on it.
On your
And then
part,
compare based on your own income.
Okay.
Okay, but irrespective in a way of which one is a better predictor, whether it is the subjective or objective measures, we're kind of trying to argue in the paper that in a sense, economic policy can be much more effective by trying to focus on observable economic outcomes and try to shift those, and less so by trying to change individuals' belief. And there are a number of studies which actually show that providing people with information does not result into very effective updating a lot of the time. So this is not necessarily a very powerful policy mechanism, right? So in a sense, we want to know how does the actual distribution of income impact people's, let's say, political behavior and preferences. So here we're going to study the link between what we call observed social mobility and political preferences. And we're going to use one particular measure, namely occupational mobility relative to one's parents. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to explain to you exactly what this index is and how it is calculated. But if you just want to kind of imagine it now, it's just an index which is going to show whether the occupation that you have is more prestigious or more higher class or higher social class than what your parents used to do when you were 14. Right? And there's a rich literature also in psychology which shows that parents are actually quite an important reference group here, right? So your environment growing up is going to shape people's political preferences, and people tend to compare themselves quite a lot to their parents when they become adults. So the literature on social mobility and objective measures is actually very small. So there's only like, I think, 3 studies that we could find after reading a lot of papers. But if anyone can point out something we missed, that would be super helpful. And here, again, the results are fairly mixed. And I will explain in a bit why I think that's the case. And we can try to show maybe where that could be improved. But essentially, you have some studies which find a negative correlation between mobilities and support for distribution. Some find no correlation, and sometimes you find different correlation on different measures, right? So for example, this paper, which is quite seminal in this field, finds a positive correlation with respect to father's education, but the negative one with respect to occupation, right? So it's not entirely clear why that might be the case. Now, we argue that the mixed results in past studies could be partly explained by the fact that it is very difficult to find data which can account for both parental status and own social status in a comparable way. So a lot of the studies that I mentioned here do not really have data on own status, and sometimes either do not control for it, or they try to proxy it by education or by income, which we will show actually do not eliminate this bias. And in our data, we're going to have comparable measures for both own and parental status in order to account for this confounding role. Another thing that we want to do here is to look at both stated preferences for a distribution and political support, which is kind of a better proxy for political behavior, because we know who people report to have voted for in the last general election, or who they might vote for if there was an election tomorrow. And we showed that the two correlate quite well. And finally, we also try to think a bit more carefully about the mechanism, right? So why is there a link between social mobility and political preferences or preferences for a distribution? And we look at 2 kind of potential ones that could be interesting. One is beliefs about fairness, which I think is very standard in the broader economic literature, because it comes back to these ideas about whether is it luck or whether there is effort that's going to determine people's beliefs. And then we're also going to talk about well-being, and I will explain a little bit how we think this may link to it. So just to give you a very quick preview of the results, so we find that both own and your parents' social status are independently positively associated with right-leaning voting. So that means if you are wealthier, and independent of that, if your parents were wealthier, you're more likely to vote conservative and less likely to vote for Labour. And they're going to be negatively associated with support for a distribution, which in a sense is fairly mechanical because these 2 parties have quite different views on redistribution. And independent of that, we show that given your own social status, those people who move up tend to be more left-wing, right? So this may be in a sense, a direct test to pick this hypothesis, and we don't really find support for that, right? So we find that people who move up in life and who do better than their parents, even though they are more conservative because they themselves are wealthier, they are less conservative than they would have been had they not moved up, right? And I will tell you a bit why we think that might be the case, but I'm also really happy to take any other suggestions.
Sorry, is it the UK data?
Yes, sorry, I should have said this is UK data.
Okay. And the years approx?
So we use the BHBS, so I think this is going from the 1990s to about 2010.
And they observe at some point, because it's people in the same household, you can observe both parents and children?
No, so we observe individuals, but we know their parents' social status when the individuals themselves were younger.
Okay. It's father-son or it's any parent?
We do both. So this is also one of the cool things with the data we use, that typically, and I think for good historical reasons, most papers have looked at like father-son distributions. We look at all. So we kind of don't segregate according to this. And I'm not going to show you results today, but if you're interested, I can say a little bit about gender as well. Yes.
I would be curious, do you have any downward mobile people? I mean, we're sort of like, are not doing as good as the parents, and how do they turn out?
That's a really good point. So, I mean, here I will show you exactly how we construct our measure, but we're actually interested in people who do better than their parents, not the same or worse. That's the majority of people in our sample, but there is a non-trivial percentage of people who do worse. We find symmetrical effects for those.
Okay, because these days a lot of discussion about, are we actually doing as good as our parents? Or are we actually doing worse?
And I think that's, yeah, indeed. So that would be very interesting, right? So this generation so far is kind of projected to have less wealth than previous generation. And there's also some kind of descriptive evidence showing that millennials are the first generation not to get more conservative as they get older. We can't say anything directly to that because we don't have data as recent as that, but we do find the symmetric effect, right? So if you move down from your parents, you're going to have the opposite effect as if you move up.
So you have more people moving up than people moving down. So in your case, it's not a zero-sum game, because I usually used to think about social mobility as a zero-sum game. If somebody moves on top, somebody needs to move.
Right. So I will show you in a second how we construct this measure. So it is really quite broad. So you have about 150 categories in this social status thing. So it's not really like better or worse.
Okay.
It's quite continuous. And in the paper, we do a lot of robustness checks. So what is better or worse? So we kind of try to do a donut thing where we exclude people who are very similar from their parents.
I see.
But I can show a bit more when we get to the analysis. And finally, and I'll show you a bit on that, we show that the mixed results in the literature can be partly explained by failing to account for own status. Okay. So data, we use 18 waves from the British Household Panel Survey. So if you're not familiar with this, this is probably the longest running representative household panel survey in the UK. So we observe individuals every year from 1991 to 2008. And in terms of outcomes, so we're going to have two sets. First is going to be voting outcomes or political support outcomes. And the second one is going to be preferences for distribution. So in terms of voting, we're going to see which political party did the respondent either vote for in the last general election or generally supports. If you're a bit familiar with the UK kind of setting, we're only going to focus on the Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties because they have kind of a clear correspondence on a left to right scale where the Conservatives are right wing, Labour's left wing and the Liberal Democrats are somewhere in the middle. We're going to exclude all other parties, which are predominantly regional parties, right? Like the SNP, because historically they're a little bit difficult to kind of put on the scale, especially because they have changed quite a bit over time. By focusing on these three, we kind of capture around 85% of voters in the UK, and it's roughly representative of England if it is that. In terms of support for distribution, we have two different questions, which we think capture slightly different flavors. So we have one, whether the government should place an upper limit on the amount of money that any other person can make. So this was in the 90s, where we were having much more progressive conversations than today.
That is radical, yeah.
But in any case, I will show you in the descriptives, quite a lot of people were fairly supportive of this policy in our sample. And this is much more salient for your own earnings. Right. And the second question is whether major public services and industry ought to be understate ownership. And this we think more about, do people perceive taxation being given towards public goods or something that is generally good? So this is a different form of redistribution or a different saliency towards your own earnings. Okay, social status. So this is going to be kind of our main explanatory measure. So this is the Hope-Goldthorpe scale, if you're familiar with it. So it's fairly continuous, like I said, so it has 142 categories. Has been used quite a lot in psychology and a little bit in economics as well. And it's ranked from low prestige occupations such as street vendors to high prestige occupations such as lawyers and accountants. In a sense, by the very nature of it, it captures only people who are in employment at the time. So it's not representative of the unemployed. So this is one of the downsides of this measure. It was originally devised for men, but is now applied for both sexes, and to our entire sample, we can actually see this both for men and women. And it is also available for respondents and for their mothers and fathers at the time when the respondent was age 14, right? So based on this, we can construct different measures of social status. So we're going to have three different specifications because we think these three different things capture various aspects. So we're first going to control for your own social status. So this is going to be given a higher rank. It's going to mean that you have a higher social status. The parental social status, so we're going to do this separately for both the status of your mother and the status of your father, and then social mobility relative to one's parents, right? So this is just going to be a dummy which takes value 1. If social mobility is higher than your parents, and 0 otherwise.
So can I ask, so the dummy variable you did define here, so if my level stays similar as my parents or strictly lower, both would be 0. Right?
Both would be 0, yeah. So because this is such a continuous measure, sometimes it can be a little bit arbitrary, or it could even be like a reporting mistake, that if you're very close around the threshold. So in the paper, we kind of exclude at some point a large set of individuals which are within I think was 20% of a standard deviation of your parents. And then we find that our results are kind of robust and even a bit stronger with that, which is what you would expect if you have some measurement error around the threshold. Okay, so let me just show you the specification and then I'll go to the results. Okay, so we're trying to essentially explain variation in this outcome variable, which is either going to be the political variable questions, right? So what party do you support, or how do you feel about those two different redistribution policies? And we're going to try to explain this by your own social status, right? So this is the social status of individual I living in region R time T being the time of the survey, right? And this beta 1 coefficient is going to essentially measure the relationship between political variables and your own social status, right? So this is not really reinventing the wheel, but we do want to kind of confirm these results in the previous literature in order to see whether it applies to our sample as well. And then we're going to control for some exogenous demographics, so we don't want to throw too much in there. So we only control for sex, age, ethnicity, and birth decades. And we also control for region and time fixed effects, right? And since the BH base is a panel, we're also going to cluster the errors at the individual level. Okay, the second specification, we're going to add to your own social status, the parent's social status, right? So this is not going to vary over time. It's going to be fixed because we only know the social status of your parents when you are 14. And this delta 2 coefficient is going to capture the effect or the relationship between your parent's social status, whether it is your mother or your father, when you are 14, and these political outcomes, right? And why do we think it's important to control for this? So there's strong evidence of intergenerational transmission of political preferences, right? So this is quite a big literature in psychology, which shows that you are more likely to vote in the same way that your parents voted. And at least part of this is going to reflect parents transmitting their social position to children, right? So you're more likely to vote conservative if your parents voted conservative, probably partly because you're wealthy, because your parents were wealthy. Right, so we want to kind of control for this channel in order to avoid any kind of confounding.
May I know what's the index R for?
Oh, sorry, that's a region. So we also control for various regions in the UK.
I is for different respondent, right?
Yes, I is the individual,
And
exactly.
T is,
and T is the time of the survey.
So you observe people in several moments in time.
Yes.
It's a panel, so this delta one is the respond of voting to the change in the social status then?
So your own social status can change over time.
Yeah.
Right? So at different points in time, you could be either above or below your parents. Your parents' social status is not going to change over time because we only know it at the age of 14.
Yeah, so for delta 2, it's a cross-sectional coefficient because this.
Exactly.
Yeah, but delta 1, is it a panel? So how do we interpret it? Is it the effect of the level on level, or if it is a panel, that's the effect of change in social status?
So we don't do fixed effects here.
You don't have individual fixed effects.
No, we
so
don't do individual fixed effects
Okay.
because with individual fixed effects, this would be collinear with the delta 2.
Yeah,
So the only dimension of the panel that we're using is to think that the standard errors are not independent because we observe
Okay.
individuals repeatedly over time. Yeah, so in this literature, it's very difficult to do a panel because your parents' social mobility is not going to,
Maybe it could also be interesting to look at people who actually do change their social status. It could also be interesting because you might be getting more risk averse, hence be more conservative. If that happens to you, relative to your parents or relative to yourself, even.
Yeah, that could be interesting. So we did think about that, and I think we should probably try to do a little bit more with that. There isn't quite that much extreme variation. So in a sense, what you're interested is not so much whether I went from 135 to 140, but more interested in whether I went up or below a certain threshold. And then we need to think a little bit more what we could do with that.
So since your delta 1 or delta 2 is just a fixed count and independent from specific IRT, which are the indexes for different respondents over different geographic data. So then are you saying that across different time or different region, the increment in my political preferences or some belief is kind of homogeneous through different intervals of time or regions?
So I mean, whatever we try to capture in this delta 1 should be independent of any like regional and time fixed effects, right? So we're kind of holding that fixed. We don't really want to capture that. But yeah, within this individual, their social status can change over time.
So for example, say for example, if you divide it generally into those 142 different categories, for example, if I do that, divide it into 3 rough, huge categories, and then your delta 1 saying that the change in my mind from category 1 to 2 is very similar to the change from category 2 to 3.
So we're not really making any assumptions about the kind of distance between rankings here.
Because I mean, like for a unit change in your HGS IRT, will always give you a change in exactly the value of that 1, no matter which value HGS IRT exactly take. So no matter it's equals to 1 and it changed from 1 to 2, or it equals to 2 but changed from 2 to 3, the effect on your Y.
Yeah, that's true.
Exactly
yeah, so that's what we assume in a sense because this is a linear specification. But you're right to point out. I mean, we could do different things with the specification. I'm not really sure, from the theory how we should think about it other than linearly, but of course you could explore other non-linear specifications.
Yeah, if you could break it in broad groups, you can get a bunch of dummies, then you don't assume linearity. If you say that these are 5 quantiles and you have dummies for that, and that's going to show you some profile.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we could try to do that and also plot it and see what visually we learn something from it. Yeah, definitely. Okay, and then finally, we're also interested in mobility, right? So we have your individual status and then we have mobility, right? And the mobility is going to say that contingent on where you are in life, what your social status ranking is there an independent effect of having moved above your parents' social status, right? And this is going to capture the effect of social mobility independent of the effect of your own social status. Okay, let me show you some results. First, just some quick descriptors so you can get a bit of feel of the sample. So about 50% voted for Labour in the last general election, 20% for Liberal Democrats, and 30% Conservative. So quite different outlook than you would probably see in recent elections. Then for the right-left spectrum, the average score is a little bit over 2. So that corresponds with a view in the UK, which is somewhat left-wing, right? Not too much, it's quite close to 2. The average respondent in the sample somewhat disagrees with an earnings ceiling, but slightly agrees with state ownership, right? So a little bit more support for the second than the first question. And in terms of the AGS score, this is on average 48. So this is the scale distribution. And about 67% of respondents, so coming back to your earlier question, exhibit social mobility relative to their mother or father. So quite a substantial sample. No, with their mother and 54 with their father, right? So people more likely to move up higher than their mother.
But here your mobility only means upward.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so in this case, 23% of people did worse than their mother and 46 did worse than their father, or the same, exactly. Okay, so let me just show you for voting Labour. I hope this is not too small, but I will try to say it out loud anyway. So if we just look at the effect of social status, so this is our first equation, right, where we just control for your own status. This is controlling for mother and father social status, and this is controlling for mobility as well. So as you can see, your own social status is quite robust and negative correlated with voting left wing. So here the dependent variable is whether you voted Labour in the last general election. So wealthier people are less likely to do so and are more likely to vote Conservative or Liberal Democrat. If you add parent status, you can see that indeed there is some evidence for this idea that there is some transmission, but it's not a lot, right? So if you compare the effect on your own HGS, this decreases by about, 20% or so. So that partly goes through the parental status, but even independent of your parental status, there is still quite a strong and significant effect about status, and parental status works in the same direction, right? So independent of how wealthy you are, having had wealthier parents makes you less likely to vote for Labour. And interestingly, if we look at mobility, mobility has the opposite effect, right? So this says that if you yourself rich, you're less likely to vote Labour, but you're more likely to vote Labour if you're rich, but moved up compared to your parents, right? And if you look at these two, they nearly cancel out, right? So intuitively, you can think of it, wealthier people are more likely to be conservative if they came from rich families. But wealthier people are less right-wing if their parents were lower social class, right? That's kind of the intuition.
Do you have any, I guess, do you have enough, you mentioned ethnicity as a control, but I guess I would be interested to see if you had enough power to see if this holds for, because I know Understanding Society, they have like ethnic minority boosts. I don't know about BHPS.
They do, and they actually have very detailed data on different ethnic categories. Here we only control for dummy whether it's white or not.
Yeah. Is that about what kind of percentage is that? Do you?
So this is a bit less. Let me see if I have some descriptive statistics.
Sorry, we can also talk about it at the end.
Question.
Because but then also, besides ethnicity, I suppose.
So 78% are white. So you have about 22%, which in that sample were non-white response. So this is not just white British, right? So this is all white. So that there is we could also just do white British, and I guess our percentage would go up.
Yeah, but also it would just be interesting to see what the difference would be. And then also for their parents' country of birth, I don't know, if they were migrants, for example, I wonder if the results would be different. And I don't know if you have enough.
Intuitively, I wouldn't know exactly what to expect.
Yeah.
Intuitively, I would expect this effect to be even stronger if your parents are migrants, but I wouldn't know exactly. We could try to look at that. Yeah, that could be interesting. Very similar stuff for the right-left spectrum, which is of course kind of by construction because you're looking at the same thing. Maybe we should just drop this measure, doesn't add that much. And then looking at these redistribution measures, we find very similar things, right? So both on earning ceilings and state ownership, your own social status is negatively correlated with the probability that you're going to support this, and the effects are stronger for earning ceiling, right? So we kind of interpret this as if putting a cap on your earnings is much more salient about the direct effect of redistribution on yourself, which is why wealthier people are more likely to be against that than be against public-owned goods, right? Or contributing to public goods indirectly. Again, we find very similar thing with the parents, right? So having wealthier parents is going to make you more likely not to support any of these policies, and social mobility is going to make you more likely to support them, right?
Isn't equation 2 and equation 3 almost automatically constructed so that we get different sizes? Because if my parents are richer, then I'm less likely to move up.
Yeah, so there is an element to that for sure, right? So the idea, so if you think about your own social status, your parents' social status, and social mobility, it's almost a bit like the issue we have with age, birth cohort.
Yeah, they're linear combinations.
Yeah, so in a sense, because you did better than your parents, that means that your parents must have been poorer. But we don't really make assumptions about how much better than your parents. And in the paper, we're actually this is actually the story we're telling, right? So social mobility is going to make people more left-wing because they came from a more humble background, which in a sense, as you say, it is kind of equivalent to saying you are more left-wing because your parents or the environment in which you grew up was, or so. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit, this. So now we want to see if we can understand why the results in the previous literature are a little bit different or so, let's say, inconsistent. And to do that, we want to compare by estimating our main equation, or especially I'm going to show you the mobility equation here without controlling for the individual's own social status. And what we would expect ex ante is a downwardly biased relationship, right? Which is intuitive because we already know that your own social status is negatively correlated with purposes for distribution, right? So I showed you that in the first equation, but it is positively correlated with social mobility, right? So by not controlling for our social status, we're going to have a downward bias in our coefficients. And this is exactly what we find, right? So if you remember, all of these coefficients were positive and strongly significant. And here we find that they are insignificant and sometimes even turn negative by failing to control for this. I didn't put it on the slide here, but in the paper, we also show that if you want to control for proxies for education and income, so these are proxies for your own social status, which is what other papers do, you find something very similar to this, right? And contingent on the size of the bias in different studies, you could explain why sometimes you find positive coefficients, why sometimes you find negative, and sometimes you find no statistical relationship. So we're trying to make the argument that it's very important to kind of shut down this channel of your own individual status. Okay. Now let me show you a little bit on mediation, and then I just want to conclude with some thoughts and then see what you think about it. So we're going to look at two different channels. One of them is subjective well-being. Why would we care about that? So I think everyone here knows that there's large literature on well-being and status. So we know that there's a positive relationship, not huge, but a positive relationship between your own income and well-being, and comparison income tends to act as a deflator, right? So doing worse than others in terms of income is not particularly good for people's well-being. So in this context, both own status and higher status relative to one's parents may actually be associated with higher well-being. Right? Why would that matter for redistribution preferences? Well, there is work of Jan and George Ward and so on recently that shows there's a strong link between well-being and political behavior. And it is possible that well-being in itself may act as a mediator in this relationship. Now, a mechanism which I think is also probably even more intuitive is beliefs about fairness, right? So this is what Piketty talks about. And what the literature on luck versus effort thinks about. And this is, again, because your own mobility, right, so your own experience may change your belief about the relative importance of working hard versus getting lucky. And beliefs are also going to inform individual attitudes on how much redistribution there should be, right? So this is the mechanism we're looking for. So what do we have? So on subjective well-being, we're going to use life satisfaction and job satisfaction. Job satisfaction, because this is an occupational index of mobility, but we're going to mostly focus on life satisfaction because this is more broad. And then on fairness, we have two questions in the BHPS. One is that, do you believe that ordinary people get their fair share of the nation's wealth? So this is one aspect of fairness. And there is one law for the rich and one for the poor. Right?
Are there any questions on luck versus effort?
No, and this is very unfortunate.
Yes, it is very
It could have been like a very much a direct test of that,
Yeah.
but no, unfortunately, they didn't announce that in the PHP. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're essentially going to re-estimate our main equations, and we're also going to add this as a control, so these two different mechanisms, and we're going to try to reveal the extent to which the main estimated coefficients, if you remember, can be accounted for by controlling for fairness or for well-being.
I have a question.
Yes.
To Katja's point, is the locus of control in the BHPS?
I'm not sure. So what kind of questions?
Because there are locus of control does
yeah.
have categories for luck and effort.
Okay, that could be
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yeah, luck is
Actually, I'm searching for it now because I know Understanding Society has it in just one wave or a couple of waves, or just
Yeah, Understanding Society has a lot more questions, but unfortunately, Understanding Society drops the HGS for parents.
Okay.
So then we cannot really control, because originally what we wanted is to also include Understanding Society, but these are new individuals, a lot of them, and we don't know the parents' HGS when they were 14.
Can you look at the BHPS sample that stayed in the Understanding Society? Or
I think it's
content?
quite small.
Okay.
Yeah, we should look at that, but I think it's a fairly small percentage. But
I
yeah.
don't know how far you want to take this, but I think the GZEP does have locus. Be interesting to look at the different countries as well, because, you know, maybe that has a different implication.
Yeah, that could be very interesting. We just have to check whether the GSUB has this like measures of HGS or something comparable also for your parents. Because what we want is quite a broad and continuous measure to kind of capture all the variation. There's a lot of studies who ask people, do you think you did better than your parents? We don't want that because that's subjective. We really want an objective measure. And then with objective measures, it's a little bit tricky. And especially if you want something a bit more, like you can have parent income, but it's super coarse. So it's a bit more difficult, but we should definitely explore some other sources. Okay, this is a huge table. So I'm just going to kind of tell you, I realize this is not super helpful. So I'm just going to kind of tell you what happens here. So life satisfaction does very little to mediate the relationship with either own status, parental status, or social mobility, right? So if you compare this table with the table I just showed you with life satisfaction, which is too many numbers now, but I can tell you that basically all the numbers on own social status and parental status stay pretty much the same. So life satisfaction has very little explanatory power, same for job satisfaction, although life satisfaction in itself is positively correlated, as we expect from the literature, with your own social status, even though the effects are fairly small, which is often the case with life satisfaction for many measures. Parental status is also negatively and significantly associated with life satisfaction, which again is kind of what you would expect, right? So if your parents were wealthier, you're going to have lower life satisfaction, contingent on your own status, and social mobility is positively and often, sometimes weakly, significantly associated with life satisfaction, right? But given that we find all this that we would expect from the theory, life satisfaction is not a mediator here, right? So it probably works from a different channel. Okay, now looking at the other two questions, right? So the fairness questions, again, a bit too many numbers, but I'll just kind of give you the nutshell. So own social status is positively related to fairness beliefs, as is parental social status, right? So this is in line with what Piketty would say. If you're wealthier, or if your parents are wealthier, you're more likely to believe society is fair. We think of this a bit as a proxy, as, you know, if you work hard, you'll get further away in life. But the socially mobile, and this is really what we think is perhaps the most interesting takeaway of the paper, are less likely to believe that society is fair, which we find quite puzzling. We have maybe some ideas, but it's a bit difficult. So what we think here is that those who moved up in life still have huge networks of people who are lower social class, including their parents and a lot of people they know. So it might be this network effect, which is like, I made it, I'm better off, but a lot of the people that I know didn't. So society is probably not as mobile. Right. This is also a bit in line with the LSE and co-author papers who show that people in Britain tend to be quite pessimistic about social mobility.
So is it that people who move up, they believe less than society is fair,
Yes.
and they vote more likely to vote Labour than people who did not move up?
So People
they
who
do it
move
at the
up
same
independent of their own social status, right? So we know that you being wealthier as an independent channel makes you believe that society is more likely to be fair, right? Which is, I think, intuitive. People who moved up holding fixed defect of their own social status are more likely to believe society is unfair, right? So this is the effect of having lower class parents on your beliefs about fairness, right? So it's not your own wealth. Your own wealth makes you believe society is fair because you moved up, but you believe it to a lesser extent than somebody who had wealthy parents. Right? That's kind of the idea. And we find that these beliefs about fairness do mediate to some extent the relationship with social mobility. And in particular, this believing that there's one law for the rich and one for the poor is the strongest mediator by far here, right? So it mediates about a third of the effect of own status on political preferences and fully mediates the relationship with state ownership. And 10 to 50% of the effect of parental social status on various outcome variables, and almost fully mediates in some cases the effect of mobility on political preferences. Okay, so just to summarize where our thoughts are so far. So we think that higher social status goes together with conservative preferences. Again, this is not really reinventing the wheel, but we show that holding your own social status constant, parental status affects political attitudes in exactly the same way. So in a sense, your parent status acts rather as a multiplier for your political preferences rather than kind of going the other way around. And we show that contrary to much of the previous literature, upward social mobility actually attenuates the effect of own status rather than reinforcing it. Failing to control for your own status could bias the coefficients here. And that's because social mobility, as I said, on its own is going to capture both the effect of your own status and the social status of the reference group, right? And here, from a policy perspective, you're much more likely to be able to target individual social status than the status of their reference group. So we think it's important to disentangle. Interestingly, so higher status respondents are both happier and more likely to believe that society is fair, which is probably consistent with what you would expect. But the socially mobile, even though they are happy, they also remain concerned about fairness, right? So you can be happier, but retain long-term concerns that there is one law for the rich and one law for the poor, which is going to make them more likely to support certain redistribution policies. And we find particularly strong effects for the provision of public goods, right? So yeah, we think this may be the mechanism, but of course we cannot really say too much about it at this stage, that socially mobile might be more likely to believe society is unfair because they are exposed to people, networks, environments growing up of people who have lower social status. So it might be a mechanism of empathy, perhaps. We're still thinking about that. But definitely those who do better than their parents are more receptive of government intervention. And then finally, this we thought about like last week, that this may be a potential explanation for the Great Gatsby curve, right? So the idea of the Great Gatsby curve, if you're familiar with it, is that the more inequality, that the amount of inequality in society is inversely proportional to the level of social mobility in society, right? So the less mobile societies are, the more inequality there will be across countries and over time and vice versa, right? So we think that this link between social mobility and left-wing preferences may lead to more redistribution in practice because people are more likely to support it or to vote for government that support those policies and therefore lead to less inequality. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I think we've already asked. Is there somebody online who has a question?
Maybe ordered models could be useful for oh, my mouse is. Do you wanna elaborate?
You were discussing at one point that you were using linear model and suggestions about breaking it up in dummy variables. My understanding is that your outcome variables are ordered. So
yes.
Maybe it would be useful to look into ordered models, especially if you're not worried about any of the endogeneity issues, because these are more difficult to deal with in ordered models.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think definitely what we should do, and we do that in the paper. So we also do order probit in the appendix, and we don't really find anything concerning there. I mean, all the results are consistent. I didn't really put it on the slides, but yeah, definitely. Or if you have other suggestions about how to do it, or is that what you had in mind?
No, that's what I had in mind, but I also was thinking, are there any sources you think of possible endogeneity maybe? Between maybe unobserved factors that affect both outcome variable and your explanatory variable?
Yeah, I mean, we're not claiming that this is, you know, like, we don't have any source of exogenous variation here, right? So this paper is more descriptive, right? We're not claiming it's causal, and of course, there's going to be some endogeneity. We do try to think in the paper about potential threats and you know, what they could be, but did you have something particularly in mind?
No, I was just wondering, but sorry, I wanted to add that it's fantastic paper. I really very much enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I mean, we were trying to think a bit of what kind of sources of exogenous variation you could think here, or how you could think a bit more accurately about it. But yeah, it's a hard to descriptive paper, but I think trying to address something that's at least, you know, the country level quite interesting and understanding the trends over time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess there could be some policy changes taxation wise, but yeah, the scale, you're only going to capture part of variation given your scale.
Yeah, and I think such an instrument might be a little bit imperfect because essentially our HGS measure is occupational based and not income based.
Yeah.
So I think taxation would be very helpful if we had a measure of income, but I think on a measure of occupation, it would be quite noisy, but we could, yeah, think about it.
Yeah, taxation for occupation is not a good. Do you have any concerns that the ordering of, so that occupation in terms of prestige changed over 40 years, which I guess is the distance between parents and children?
Yeah, so I mean, so this AGS measure, I think we would have to think a bit more about the literature and revisit it, but I remember that when we were reading about it, they have done quite a bit of robustness checks on this, and they tend, because the categories are actually, they're quite continuous, but they're not that, you know, continuous that you would have huge inversions there.
Okay.
But perhaps what you suggested earlier, where we do this kind of broader deciles, that could partly address that. Because if you would have this change in meaning, you would expect it to be kind of in the same neighborhood. You wouldn't expect inversions from, like, you know, the top 10% to the bottom 10% in terms of prestige.
Yes, not in this period of time, your time frame.
But yeah, maybe we can try deciles, quantiles, something like that, just to see whether the results are robust to a bit more of a coarse measure. Yeah. I mean, we're also a little bit worried about things like ceiling effects and floor effects, but then we draw up different parts of the distribution and it doesn't really seem to matter much. But yeah, that's, yeah, we'll look at that. Yeah.
I would be interested to look at sort of like how you, I mean, where you started off, here your parents, and here are you then, but maybe everybody else in surrounding you, even those who started off from the same, is now here.
Yeah, so there would be a different reference group essentially.
Yeah.
I think the concern that, you know, you might have other networks that are more important to you, like peers, or
maybe you're looking more at sort of like your surroundings, you know, how you fared relative to not your parents necessarily, but maybe your peers or your region or.
No, I mean, I would love to be able to do that, but we don't really have data on that. Maybe if we were to conduct our own survey, maybe if this is of interest, we could think about that. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, in a sense, you can have so many reference groups, right? You think about your spouse, you can think about your work colleagues, you can think about people you went to school with, and I'm sure possibly all of those work through similar mechanism, or potentially they're different mechanisms. One thing that I might say is that maybe the results for parents might be even weaker than what you would expect given your peer groups.
Yeah, I guess following on the peer groups. So if you show that around 70% of people moved up, so maybe you can split them on those who moved, because there is some average move up for the generation, and then there are people who moved above the average. So if you isolate those only, the effect should be stronger because you sort of expected, there was some expected level of moving up with the society, but then you overdid it, and that's the actual mobility.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we did try, so we did draw people who moved up less than 20% of standard
Okay.
deviation from their parents, and then we find the effects are stronger, but I think that's what you would expect.
Yeah, so that's,
yeah.
that's.
And also the 70% is relative to mothers. With fathers, it's more like 50%.
Okay.
So then it's more variation that way.
Yeah, and it's more in line because, yeah, generally social mobility is a zero-sum game, right? But somehow, maybe it's a zero-sum game within, so fathers to fathers would be a zero-sum game, given the time frame. Children
Yes.
to mothers are still not a zero-sum
Yeah.
game because mothers were at the bottom.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I like the paper a lot. I think you can extend it in so many ways. People are like moving up, you know, or down. Are they more, you know, giving? Are they more pro-social? Are they more with the risk-taking? I mean, it's very interesting. You can take this in many directions in addition.
Yeah, so one
Different
thing
papers.
that I think would be very cool is whether, so what I think is really interesting here is that people have more support for public goods. It would be really cool if we could have a measure, maybe in a different survey, of private donations. I'm not sure if this is available, but yeah, it would be really interesting. What do you think of, you know, public goods as substitutes to other things? Are you more likely to donate to different charities and so on? But I don't know of a survey that kind of captures that. I don't think the BHPS doesn't. But then we can think about the measures of pro-sociality, perhaps.
Yeah.
Or altruism. That could be interesting and hopefully correlated
Volunteering.
with redistribution.
Simona said volunteering, another one.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for example.
Yeah, generally because the setting seems super universal like this, you just change the dependent variable and you have the effect of social mobility on various. Yeah, that is very cool.
I'd be interested in those who move down particularly, but
Yeah, I think we should show that as well. So we did do it. So if you construct the dummy the other way around, so people who move down compared to the same or higher, and we find the exact opposite effects. And I don't think, so the coefficients are not, like if you take the absolute value, not statistically significant. So it is quite symmetrical there. But yeah, maybe we can think of more nonlinear ways to explore this rather than thresholds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
any more questions online here?
No.
No, I think then maybe we close it. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you
thanks so much for all the
Great.
comments. Very much.
Fantastic.
I always said, I mean, Paul Dolan always brings this argument that
By the social
if people like sort of like made it up and actually come from very poor backgrounds, you know, they sort of like say, many people sort of become arrogant in the sense that, you know, I made it, so why don't the other people make it?
Yeah, I mean, that's really like the